This is the third in a series of videos about the Lelantine War, a war fought in the late 8th or early 7th century BCE in Euboea or Evia between the neighbouring settlements of Chalkis and Eretria. In part 1, we saw how the Euboeans were at the vanguard of Greek trade, culture and overseas expansion in the 8th century. If things had turned out differently, then perhaps today we would still remember Chalkis and Eretria as the epicenter of the Greek classical age, though it was not quite to be. In part 2, we surveyed the literary sources for the war. Now, I've titled this little series, The Classical Era Starts Here. I'm sure some of you took one look at that title and thought, sake, everyone knows that the classical period was in the 5th and 4th century BCEs and the Lelantine War was in the 8th or 7th, so what the hell are you on about? Well, yeah, it was a rather bold assertion on my part. Here's my, albeit fanciful, justification for my claim. And in this video, I'm going to take a more speculative, romanticised take, my personal responses and musings on the war. Now, with that caveat out the way, welcome to Ancient Classics. To me, the most intriguing element from the ancient sources about the war is the passage from Strabo Book 10, in which, citing a now lost epigraphical source, Strabo claims that the Chalcidians and Eretrians agreed to refrain from using missile weapons. Some commentators have gone so far as to describe this as some kind of arms control treaty. Now, what if Strabo or his source are describing not so much a bilateral treaty, but rather that they are drawing upon memories of a shift in military technologies and tactics? Or as Donlan puts it, perhaps the inscription that Strabo saw concerns not a voluntary ban on missiles in the Lelantine War, but is a garbled remembrance that close combat replaced long-range fighting at some point during the war. Now, perhaps you've guessed where I'm going with this. What if the Lelantine War illustrates and typifies the Hoplite Revolution? Or if I'm really going to let my fancy rip, what if the Lelantine War was a proving ground for Hoplite tactics, or even the spark for their adoption? Now, maybe you've heard of this Hoplite Revolution or Hoplite Reform as more measured versions of the theory describe it, and maybe you think it's a load of garbage, totally overhyped, and indeed many do. But for everyone else, let me attempt to crudely summarize what this Hoplite Revolution was all about. Just imagine the archetypical classical Greek warrior, a hoplite. Buff guys in full panoply, helmet, shin greaves, a breastplate fashioned from bronze or reinforced linen, and I don't just mean a t-shirt, those linothoraxes were heavy duty. And of course, a shield, the hoplon. Think of them, advancing and clashing in tight formation, the phalanx. That's a powerful image of a mighty fighting force, typified in popular culture by the movie 300, without the bare chests, of course. Against such a force, arrows and slingshots are kind of pointless. Again, think of those scenes from the movie 300, or to quote a more sober but nonetheless highly romanticised account of the Battle of Thermopylae, think of Herodotus' telling of the legendary words of the Spartan Dionysius. Just before they fought the Persians, some guy from Chalkis reported that when the barbarians released their arrows, they eclipsed the sun. There were just so many of them. But Dionysius was unfazed and made light of the number of Persians, saying that his Thracian friend brought good tidings. If indeed the Persians eclipse the sun, then they'll have their battle in the shade. The Battle of Thermopylae was of course a clash between two very different cultures, with different fighting styles. But when Greeks fought Greeks, as they so often did, it would have been phalanx against phalanx, hoplite against hoplite. There really wouldn't have been much of a space for archers at all, say for minor skirmishes and the like. One can even imagine that archery, let alone slingshots, would have been seen as rather infra-dig, even unmanly. Any self-respecting free man would have dedicated himself to training to fight like a hoplite, equipped as such and dressed as such. Archery would have been the preserve of mercenaries hired in from Crete or even Scythia. But the theory goes It wasn't always like that. There must have been a shift in weaponry and tactics. Think back to the battle scenes in Homer. It's a very different fighting style, with dueling champions chucking spears and rocks at each other, crazy hardcore forefighters of promachoi charging ahead of the rabble, the laos, that play a supporting role from behind. And indeed, archery plays a role too in Homeric combat, albeit that even in Homer, archery is a little bit uncool, excepting of course the bit in the Odyssey when Odysseus kills the suitors, but that's not a real battle. Now, one, of course, can't cite the Homeric battle scenes as literal depictions of early Greek warfare, and the detractors of the Hoplite revolution theory will cite references throughout the Homeric epics to more orderly forms of war, and there are indeed phalanxes throughout the Iliad. But still the theory goes that the Greeks adopted hoplite warfare relatively late on, perhaps in or around the 8th or 7th century, i.e. roughly the time of the Lelantine War. But it goes deeper than that. See, the Hoplite revolution theory is not just about fighting. The more extreme and developed or fanciful variants of the theory make a connection between the adoption of hoplite weapons and tactics and socio-political innovations, even changes in thought. Crudely put, a well-functioning phalanx of hoplites necessitates the disciplined cooperation of equally armed men. No show-offs, no psychos or guys privileged enough to afford the best kit fighting up front on their own, fighting for personal glory. Nor is this just a one-off thing, the preserve of specialist warriors. War in some form or another would have been a perennial concern of all free men of a fighting age. From boyhood into middle age, men would have trained hard, and together their whole lives would have revolved around this form of collective, cohesive warfare in which everyone plays an equal and important role. Individual egos are subsumed, made to serve the collective might of the phalanx and in turn the nascent city-state. In the very most extreme versions of the theory, the hoplite revolution therefore leads directly to the birth of democracy, or at least to a more highly evolved form of political governance. Even more sober versions of the theory, supposing even that only the relatively wealthy could have afforded the hoplite gear and training, they would have made up a powerful body within the populace. An elite class, but nonetheless a sizable elite, far outnumbering the traditional kingly class. A sufficiently large number to shake up and influence politics and to prompt a move away from king-based or big man culture to one in which factions form and influence the course of political events, i.e. where new men, tyrants and the like can acquire power, wrested away from the older order thanks to the support of a now effectively enfranchised fighting force. Now, the theory of hoplite revolution is relatively modern. The classic paper in English on the subject was by H.L. Lorimer in 1947. And there are no direct ancient sources for the view that the hoplite revolution brought about political or social change, although some do cite some passages from Aristotle's Politics as evidence. For example, Aristotle wrote, "And indeed the earliest form of constitution among the Greeks after the kingships consisted of those who were actually soldiers, the original form consisting of the cavalry. But as states grew, and the people in war gear, hoploi, became stronger, more persons came to have a part in the government. Hence what we now call constitutional governments, the men of former times called democracies." Now, I've already given the strong caveat that I'm going off on a total flight of fancy in this video. Even so, I feel compelled to point out that what I've just said is a massive oversimplification, and even the basic tenets of the hoplite revolution theories have been challenged or outright debunked. Anyway, here are a load of papers on the subject, some proponents, others opponents of the hoplite revolution theory in its various forms. I've now discharged my duty to be even-handed and sober about this. Let's get back to my flight of fancy. And indeed, back to our theme, the Lelantine War. Suppose we accept this premise that the hoplite revolution or hoplite reform was a thing, and suppose we accept that it led to innovations in politics and society in some form or another, if not outright democracy. Let's just presume all that. On that basis, is it reasonable to view the Lelantine War as an example of the Hoplite Revolution in action? Lorimer, in his seminal 1947 paper, writes, "If we accept a 7th century date for the Lelantine War, then we probably have a hint of the process of trial and error involved in developing the use of psiloi, lightly armed troops, in conjunction with the phalanx in Strabo's account of the agreement, whereby the Chalkidians and Eretrians bound themselves me krestai telebalos, not to use missiles." Donlan takes it further still. The period from circa 700 to 650 BC was a transitional stage in arms and tactics. The combined factors of the length of time, number of participants, and the innovations in military matters that were taking place would make this war a fertile testing ground for weapons and tactics. The plain itself, suitable for massed formations, may also have contributed to the development. Donlan then proceeds to explain that any interpretation of the inscription that Strabo saw as a banning of missiles on ethical grounds is highly unlikely, if only because they would be less effective against the heavily armoured foot soldier after the introduction of hoplite armour. And he also notes that the other possible reason for a deliberate ban, a gentleman's agreement to ensure that fighting would be of a knightly character, does not convince. Donlan then puts forward the conjectural explanation of the inscription cited by Strabo. An ancient inscription had indeed contained the information, not that the missiles were banned by agreement, but that either side had ceased to employ them at some point in the war. In other words, the 7th century Euboeans had recorded a noteworthy event, the transition from long-range to close combat. So to summarize, the Lelantine War could perhaps be seen as illustrating and exemplifying or even promulgating the innovations in weapons and military tactics known as the Hoplite Revolution. If that is so, then it is also tempting to see it as an indirect cause of, or at least an illustration of, the phenomena that would go on to cause the broader social and political revolutions that would influence the subsequent history of the Greek people, the mores of the classical age. From that, let's move to regional politics and the balance of power. I've made it a point to stress, especially in the first video of this series, how important Euboea, and especially Eretria and Chalkis, were in the development of Greek trade and culture in the period leading up to the Lelantine War. Yet, with all due respect to the folks of Evia today, they don't really feature much in popular histories of the classical period. It does seem indeed that after the war, Euboea went into a period of decline, whether in absolute terms or in comparison to their near neighbours, Athens in particular. To quote Forrest, "If the end of the Lelantine War shed the light of peace on a troubled Euboea, it brought none of any kind to its history. We are left with a Chalkis still stubbornly unyielding of archaeological truth, an abandoned Lefkandi, a prospering New Eretria and other cities, so far as we know, much as they were before, but none of them, not even Eretria, figures more than occasionally, and usually accidentally, in anything that could be called the mainstream of Greek history." Likewise, the presence of born and bred Euboeans, if not their colonial descendants, abroad went into decline. Coldstream, in his classic survey of geometric Greece, notes that by the end of the 8th century, these manifold symptoms of commercial prosperity were vanishing fast. Euboean pottery exports to the Levant, to Italy and Sicily, even to the Aegean, had dwindled to almost nothing. Likewise, Parker goes so far as to call post-war Euboea a backwater, both Chalkis and Eretria being left as losers in the war between themselves. Could it have been that with Chalkis and Eretria mutually defeated and exhausted by the war, space opened up for other powers to thrive, Athens, for example? Of course, it would be completely unfair on Athens to suggest that it thrived only because of the mutual destruction of the leading powers of Euboea. There are many other factors that explain Athens' rise, not least its increasing ability to exploit the silver mines at Lavrion. But regardless of whether its rise was facilitated by Eretria and Chalkis' decline, Athens nonetheless became dominant and gained some direct political power over Euboea. Certainly Chalkis eventually fell under Athens' sphere of influence. To quote Aelian, referring perhaps to the 6th century, "When the Athenians took control of Chalkis, they divided the land into parcels for 2,000 settlers. This was the area known as the Hippopotas. They consecrated shrines to Athena in the place called the Lelantine, and they leased out the rest of the land according to the pillars, which stand by the Stir Basilios and carry a record of the leases. They put the prisoners in chains and even then did not reduce their animosity against the Chalcidians. Maybe it's just me being a self-obsessed Brit, but I'm tempted to draw parallels between the exhaustion of Chalkis and Eretria and their consequent backseat role in Greek politics and culture, whilst Athens and the like became predominant, with the commonplace view that World War II left Britain exhausted and spent, such that it could no longer be described as a great power, and that the end of its empire became an inevitability, whilst the USA, though of course already a major economic and political power before the war, assumed or more confidently performed its role as the indisputable superpower of the West. And perhaps Euboea's decline following the war was no accident, no unintended consequence. In my previous video, I cited the key points from Bredine's 1947 paper on the Lelantine War and Phaedon of Argos. In that paper, Bredine placed the Lelantine War in the context of a wider pan-Hellenic power play, wherein the Argive tyrant Phaedon provoked or exploited the Lelantine War specifically to weaken and bring down his rival in the West. Now, Bredine's paper, by his own admission, verges on the speculative, but hey, this video is all about speculation, and even so, stranger things have happened in geopolitics. Speaking of the Peloponnese, what about Sparta? Nothing, so far as I'm directly aware, connects the fates of Euboea and Sparta, but it is instructive to draw parallels between the Lelantine War and the Messenian Wars, which I covered in my videos on Aristomenes nearly 2 years ago. They were broadly contemporaneous, 8th or 7th century BCE. Both took place several generations before the written historical record, and our evidence from them is largely found in later authors reliant on now lost sources. But looking back at them through the lens of regional politics, just as the Lelantine War possibly took Euboea out of action, opening things up for Athens, so Sparta's regional dominance was owed, perhaps in part, to the Messenian Wars. Thus we can see both the Lelantine War and the Messenian Wars as serving a similar function in setting the political stage for future eras, ultimately leading to the multi-decade-long clash between the two dominant powers of Athens and Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. Indeed, I quoted Aelian earlier as evidence for Athens' subsequent dominance over Chalkis. Well, Aelian immediately follows that up with a passage about Sparta and its control over Messenia, implying that he too saw a parallel between the fates of Chalkis and Athens on the one hand, and Messenia and Sparta on the other. Well, that's about all I've got. Very little is known about the war, its causes, or indeed its aftermath. I think, however, it is safe to say that before the war, Chalkis and Eretria were at the vanguard of Greek culture, trade and territorial expansion, and then they weren't. And they remained second or third-rate powers pretty much thereafter, whilst others led the way. We can't say for sure that the Lelantine War was the cause of this decline, but it certainly feels like that to me. Alongside the Messenian Wars, the Lelantine War shaped or facilitated subsequent Greek history. They all seem in some way or other to set up, by chance or design, the power dynamic between Athens and Sparta, which would characterize the classical age. Perhaps Thucydides was right, therefore, in focusing on the Lelantine War as an implied precursor to his own theme, the Peloponnesian War, in much the same way as he also implied that the more mythical Trojan War was to the Persian Wars. Then, more impressionistically, perhaps we can view the Lelantine War as an early example, a ground zero for the kind of military tactics that would characterize the classical period, and perhaps even, if one is to adopt the more extreme readings of the Hoplite revolution theory, one could say that the war served as a testing ground for tactics which, once adopted, developed and promulgated, would influence the social and political tides, trends and ideas that would culminate with the classical age. Shout out to my friend Michael Walton for the artwork for this video. Next time, I don't know, maybe some Homer. Feel like we need some Homer. Meantime, like and subscribe, and we'll be back soon.